Once, Britain's working streets were stitched from soot, washing lines in the steady rhythm of shift changes. Terraced houses leaned into each other for warmth, brick shoulders touching along every narrow road. Morning began with the same soundtrack every day, kettles boiling behind thin walls and factory horns cutting through the fog. Boots thudded in chorus on wet pavements, heels finding the same loose slabs generation after generation. Front doors opened straight onto the street, no gardens, just a single worn step that knew every family shoe. Milk bottles waited in tight clusters by doorways, glass fogged with cold breath from the sleeping houses. Inside, staircases rose steep and narrow, polished by decades of hands sliding along the banister. Wallpaper tried its best to brighten the rooms, bravely patterned over cracks that no one bothered to hide. Coal dust settled in corners like a second, darker skirting board that never quite disappeared. On winter mornings, breath showed in bedrooms, ghost in the air before the first fire finally caught. At the street's corner, a tiny shop held everything and nothing, shelves bending under tins and packets. The bell above the door rang with the same tired enthusiasm for every customer, welcome or late pay. Behind the counter, the owner knew the weight of each family's worries better than any accountant. Notebooks lived beneath the till, filled with penciled promises to pay when the next wage envelope arrived. Children learned early which jars were safe to touch, and which meant a sharp warning from behind the scale. Outside, washing lines crisscrossed the back alleys, white shirts and work socks declaring the week's routine. Monday, steam rose from shared yards, copper tubs boiling as neighbours compared aches and rumours. Laundry, pegged shoulder to shoulder, turned narrow spaces into moving corridors of cotton and steam. When rain came suddenly, hands flew to windows, voices shouting across yards as lines were grabbed at speed. The factory sat at the end of the view like a full stop, chimneys writing long sentences of smoke across the sky. Windows glowed dull orange in early darkness, machines beat in time for a town that lived by their rhythm. Workers poured through the gates at shift change, faces grey with tiredness but brightening at the sight of familiar streets. Their footsteps spread back along the terraces, breaking into smaller paths toward kettles, radios and waiting plates. In shared back passages, kids turned cracked concrete into stadiums, chalk lines standing in for white paint. A dented tin served as goalpost, boundary marker and treasure box, depending on the game and the argument. Ball games ended only when daylight vanished, or a shout from a doorway cut the evening clean in half. Older neighbours sat on doorstep thrones, commenting on technique, manners and hemlines with equal confidence. Cats threaded through the scene like unofficial inspectors, checking each yard for warmth, food and gossip. On payday nights, the street changed tempo, coats brushed down, hair slicked back with extra care. Windows glowed a little brighter, curtains twitching as people checked who was heading where and with who. The smell of chips drifted from the main road, salt and hot fat calling louder than any advertisement. Queues formed outside the chippy, steam fogging the glass until the menu became guesswork and habit. Newspapers soaked up grease as hands carried parcels home like fragile trophies against the cold. In one front room, a family gathered around a small table, coins tipping from brown envelopes into careful piles. Rent, coal, food, and dreams were counted in the same slow rhythm, fingers moving faster than words. Sometimes a single coin rolled free, hesitating on the wood before deciding which bill it would rescue. Upstairs, radios tuned carefully through static, catching dance bands, football scores, and faraway voices. The aerial on the roof tilted just enough in the wind to decide whether a song arrived clear or broken. Later, streets narrowed under darkness, light spilling from pub doorways like warm, uneven rivers. The local sat on the corner like a second living room, louder and more forgiving than the first. Inside, smoke braided with laughter and arguments, pint glasses marking the table like temporary landmarks. Stories grew taller with every round, shrinking again in the cold air of the walk home. Sunday mornings tried to scrub everything clean, pavements washed by rain and careful sweeping. Women shook mats over railings, sending crumbs and dust spiraling into the quiet street. Church bells climbed the air above factory roofs, calling the same names they had for generations. Children in their best clothes dragged scuffed shoes along the curb, half proud, half uncomfortable. Afterwards, roasts scented whole rows of houses at once, gravy and cabbage steaming through thin wall, windows fogged from the inside, patterns traced briefly by bored fingers before disappearing again. As the years moved on, planners arrived with rolled maps and clean shoes, pointing at corners that needed change. They spoke of light, air and progress, of rooms big enough to turn around in without touching the wall. Photographs were taken of leaning chimneys and damp cellars, proof that the old streets had failed. Notices appeared on doors in official language, heavy words sitting oddly on chipped paint. Some residents read them twice, lips moving, trying to catch the part where choice had already gone. Rumours spread faster than facts, filling barber chairs and bus queues with half-true futures. Kids listened from stairwells, piecing together fragments about towers, grass and roads wide enough for anything. They imagined corridors without drafts, windows that closed properly, bathrooms that belonged only to one family. Surveyors paced out measurements in quiet bedrooms, their footsteps sounding strangely official on worn floorboards. Chalk marks appeared on outside walls, symbols understood only by those carrying clipboards and folded plans. Some nights, kitchen conversations turned into quiet rehearsals of leaving, each plate passed as if already packed. Others refused to picture anywhere else, fingers tracing familiar cracks in plaster like old map lines. When demolition finally began, the street woke to the bite of machinery instead of factory horns. Bricks that had held generations together collapsed in clouds of dust and memory. Wallpaper surfaced briefly in the ruins, patterns hanging in the open air before falling with the rest. Doors that once slammed in arguments now swung gently above rubble, attached to nothing at all. Children watched from behind temporary fences, eyes wide, tasting grit and change on the same cold wind. New estates rose on the edges of town, concrete frames pushing up where fields once soaked the rain. Show homes offered clean angles and fitted kitchens, carpets without stains or stories. Brochures promised sunshine through wide windows, safe play areas, and modern convenience. Keys were handed over in brief ceremonies, handshakes trying to stand in for rooted history. In the new flats, corridors echoed at first, footsteps ringing along walls still smelling of paint. Lifts hummed uncertainly between floors, their buttons tiny promises of effort saved. From high balconies, the old factory chimneys looked smaller, almost decorative against the horizon. Some residents slept better without traffic at the window, others lay awake missing the noise. Down below, grass verges and small squares waited for ownership, edges too neat to feel lived in yet. Kids tested every corner for games, learning which stairwells amplified shouts the longest. Old neighbours found each other again by instinct, clustering on benches and near bin stalls. They compared views like weather, deciding whether height made up for distance from the old streets. Buses took longer to reach the centre now, routes curling through roundabouts and wide new roads. On the ride in, passengers stared at passing layouts of parking bays, lampposts and identical front doors. The corner shops of the past shrank into a single supermarket, bright, efficient and slightly anonymous. Here no one knew your tab or your grandmother's cough, only barcodes and special offers. Yet somewhere between the aisles, old habits survived, neighbours meeting by the bread and trading new. On quiet afternoons, the new estates felt almost paused, curtains half drawn, televisions glowing in separate boxes. The old streets lived on in conversations, pulled out like photographs whenever silence grew too big. People described the exact sound of rain on slate roofs, the way voices travelled along the terrace at night. They remembered neighbours by doorway colour and washing line pattern rather than full names. Stories clung to small details: the loose step outside number 9, the cracked window nobody fixed. Back in the town centre, a few surviving terraces still clung to the edges of busy roads. Their bricks darkened by exhaust fumes. They watched traffic patterns that had never been designed for them. New signs hung over old doorways, takeaway menus replacing hand-painted shopfront. Above, curtains twitched in flats that still measured distance in the number of steps to the pavement. Delivery scooters lined the curb where kids once chalked hopscotch squares and football goals. At dusk, sodium lights washed the brickwork in an artificial orange, flattening old scars and repairs. Shadows from passing buses crawled slowly across walls that had seen horse carts and prams. In side alleys, bricked-up windows marked where rooms had once reached for extra air. Plants rooted in forgotten gutters, small stubborn patches of green ignoring every redevelopment plan. Sometimes film crews arrived hunting authenticity, setting cameras where real lives had been packed away. Extras in costume trailed past, satellite dishes and wheelie bins, history and present sharing the same narrow space. Local residents watched from their doorsteps, amused and slightly protective of streets suddenly declared cinematic. They pointed out which houses had real stories better than anything in the script. Developers saw potential where others saw memory, sketching glass and steel over rows of tiled roofs. Brochures renamed districts with fresh polished titles that carefully avoided the word slum. Loft apartments appeared where attics once stored prams, trunks and spare blankets for winter. Roof lines sprouted skylights, open in the view to skies that earlier generations had only guessed at. Coffee shops moved into former corner pubs, trade signs replaced by minimalist logos and clean font. Inside, exposed brick became a feature rather than something to hide behind plaster. New customers admired the character, unaware of the arguments, jokes and songs soaked into those walls. Old residents counted faces and prices, then chose to drink tea in quieter kitchens instead. Estate agents talked about transport links and creative hubs, phrases that floated strangely above worn paving stone. Virtual tours glided through rooms where coal fires once smoked, and wallpaper never quite met at the corners. From certain angles, only the front walls remained of the original street, propped up like scenery. Behind them, new structures rose in pale materials, lighter but somehow less rooted. Original door numbers survived as decoration, digits that no longer matched the lives inside. At night, old and new windows glowed side by side, different bulbs sharing the same narrow slice of sky. Somewhere between them, the memory of gaslight lingered like an afterimage whenever power briefly failed. On rainy evenings, water still found the same paths along brick and stone, ignoring every redesign. Downpipes rattled with familiar urgency, carrying decades of storms past modern insulation. In surviving back alleys, cobbles shone under puddles, rounding off reflections of satellite dishes and bikes. Here, wheelie bins stood where coal sacks once slumped, plastic replacing Hessian without ceremony. Graffiti traced fresh names over fading painted adverts, layers of claim and counterclaim on the same wall. Cats still patrolled their routes along fence tops and low roofs, unbothered by estate boundaries. They slipped through gaps no planner had drawn, stitching together pieces of the old map. Elderly residents moved more slowly now, but their mental street plan remained sharper than any digital map. They could still list who had lived in each house, long after postcards stopped arriving from those addresses. Sometimes they paused at corners that no longer existed, eyes searching for doorways erased by time. A faint smile or sigh marked the spot before they moved on, memory stepping over what concrete had covered. Local schools carried the last echo of the old catchment lines, class photos mixing children from new towers and last terraces. Playgrounds rang with accents from far beyond these counties, layered over the flat vowels of the older streets. Parents swapped stories at the gate, some about distant homelands, others about factories that no longer hire. The shared detail was always housing: how much space, how many stairs, how thin the walls. Community centres tried to replace the informal doorsteps of the past with notice boards and scheduled events. Inside, tea urns steamed under fluorescent lights, folding chairs arranged in hopeful circles. Posters advertised advice sessions, dance classes, and lost dog appeals, all written in multiple languages. On wet nights, only a few made it through the doors, but those few carried entire networks of neighbours with them. At the edge of town, new housing phases kept appearing on glossy signs long before the first brick was laid. Computer images showed idealised families walking dogs along paths that had never felt real much. Old residents squinted at the boards, trying to recognise fields that once held bonfires and goalposts. Where allotments had spread in uneven rows, survey stakes now marked strict numbered plots of future driveways. Rusting sheds waited for their final season, tools hanging in silence above soil that had fed whole streets. In the city, a few untouched terraces survived by accident, inaccessible to cranes and spreadsheets. Their narrow fronts faced each other like old friends, refusing to step aside for wider plans. Here, wheelie suitcases thudded over cracked paving as new tenants dragged lives between rented rooms. Short leases stacked on top of long histories, each year adding another thin layer of present. Sometimes faint chalk marks still appeared on walls where children played with nothing more than time and imagination. Landlords repainted between tenants, but the smell of damp came back quicker than the gloss dried. Behind thin plaster, old fireplaces bricked up decades ago still shaped the rooms around them. Council records listed these streets in careful columns, each property a number in need of future decisions. On paper, they were units and potential, not the soundtrack of footsteps and arguments that once filled them. Archivists boxed up photographs of long-gone doorways, writing neat labels in cool, permanent ink. In those images, women lean on brooms, men in caps stare at the camera, kids blur into streaks of movement. Their faces look straight through the lens at a future they never expected to comment on them. Museums built small mock-ups of two-up, two-down houses, complete with tin baths and borrowed smell. Visitors stepped cautiously over reproduction lino, hearing recordings of voices that spoke of rationing and rent books. For some it was history, for others it sounded suspiciously like their grandparents and yesterday. Back outside, current estates stretched in low repeating patterns, each cul-de-sac ending in a turning circle. Street names borrowed from flowers, poets and distant hills, anything but the factories they replaced. At night, car headlights looped predictable routes, tracing shapes that planners had drawn years before. Yet in upstairs rooms, people arranged photos on shelves, magnets on fridges, coats on familiar hooks. They argued over volume levels, lent sugar next door, and worried about bills in familiar ways. New generations learned to ride bikes along safe paths, circling patches of grass as if they were village green. They knew the old streets only from comments and half-finished sentences at family table. Still, when rain hit the windows just right, something in the sound tugged at older memories. Across Britain, fragments of working streets remain like stubborn stitches, holding different eras together. A single terrace behind a supermarket, a lone corner shop between glass towers, a yard hidden behind new fences. People passed them daily without noticing, or slowed just enough to feel a tug they couldn't name. For a moment, the faint echo of washing lines, boot steps, and shouted names seemed to rise from the brick. Then traffic rolled on, doors closed, and the present reclaimed its usual volume. The old streets did not vanish entirely. They thinned into habits, stories, and the way people still stand at corners. Somewhere between demolished chimneys and freshly painted balconies, Britain's working heart kept beating quietly on.